us time to practice. We'll be deploying soon. Training is over. Time to see what you have learned. Gas is approaching your position. Move to the safe zone.
Let them go! Get ready!
Clear to engage all targets.
I'm here! I'm taking fire!
And you return to the front line. You lose, your fight is over. Earn your way out.
Flash out!
Lost the fight. Return to base. Not over yet. Your team can still buy your release. Check your gear and weapons. We go soon. Practice is over. The real fight begins now. safe zone.
Get ready!
Eliminate all targets in the AO. Losing ground.
I got movement. I got movement. I got movement. Hey, disregard last. Moving up. I got movement. I got movement.
The drop bag inbound.
I got movement. Target marked. Send it.
Loader 2-0, good copy. Cluster strike away.
Gas is close. Get to the safe zone.
I got movement.
Huh? Copy that.
Going over here.
Gas is moving. Gulag now. Fight to earn redeployment. Win here and you return to the front line. You lose, your fight is over. Earn your way out. Lost the fight. Return to base. It is not over yet. Your team can still buy your base. Enemy personal radar in the air. UAV overhead.
Yeah, I'll take that.
tracking your position.
I can fly it. Let's go.
Gas is closing. Get to the new safe zone. Left. Keep up the good work.
Okay.
Return to base for debrief.
Enemies in the air! Disregard last. Enemies in the area!
Only 10 remain standing.
Clear. Regroup in the safe zone. Moving!
Five remaining.
Not all here. Regroup in the safe zone.
while you can. We deploy soon.
I'm here!
Enough training. Now we face the enemy for real. Battle Royale. Mark a drop point for your team. You'll lead them in. Gas is approaching your position. Move to the safe zone.
That's our drop zone! Get ready!
Here's a good spot.
Hunt the enemy down.
I'm here! I'm here!
You're in the gulag now. Fight to earn redeployment. A fight has started. Get ready. You're next. Win here and you return to the front line. You lose, your fight is over. It's time. Break some.
I'm taking fire!
Lost the fight. Return to base. It is not over yet. Your team can still buy your release. take this time to warm up. Preparation is done. Now you deploy to the war zone. Battle Royale. Mark a drop point for your team. You'll lead them in. Gas is approaching your position. Move to the safe zone.
That's our drop zone! Get ready!
Primary objective is to eliminate all targets.
Does anyone need this? SMG here. Pistol here. Moving.
Supply cache located. Area secure. Here we go. You're up next. Get ready. You win this fight and you return to the front line. But if you lose, you're done. It's time. Break some. return to base. Form up all you can. We deploy soon. Mark a drop point for your team. You'll lead them in. Gas is approaching your position. Move to the safe zone. Hunt the enemy down. You win this fight and you return to the front line, but if you lose, you're done. Earn your way out. You're completing. Back to base with you. You fought hard out there. Return to base for debrief.
had a family once. A wife
This is beautiful.
and a son. And I buried them along with everyone I even knew. What has happened to me? Am I dead?
You are banished from death. Cast adrift between the worlds of light and dark. You are bound together, Talion. My life and yours.
Who are you, Wraith?
I shaped the history of Middle-earth. I crafted the Rings of Power.
Celebrimbor, greatest smith of the Second Age. Sauron deceived you into making the rings. He tortured both you and your kin.
Perhaps that pain was what nets us.
I should have died with my family.
I thought you wanted revenge. But there is only one way to close the circle. To defeat Sauron.
The time has come for a new ring.
The world of men is ending. I have seen it. I have felt it. In the fires of Mount Doom.
Talion. Talion.
I will find you.
but shadows and death.
Need to keep quiet. These orcs are preparing for war.
What was that?
You're getting jumpy.
Famous last word.
Talion. Talion.
I'm going to kill him. Not hurt. I'm going to kill him.
You've come far.
This place gives me the creeps. Would you?
You wait.
Never know what. Did you hear that? Spider here, spider there. One of these things looks at me wrong. I'm gonna kill it. Are they just in my head? Look, there's been a murder.
We must defeat her. Come, Talion. Free me.
Hey, Middle Earth will be ours.
But we'll still fight with each other for fun, right? I don't know what I'd do if I had to wait to see a pink skin to get me jollies.
See the
I wonder what things are like outside Mordor.
When we're done fighting, they're gonna be the same as they are in Mordor.
He's a fearsome one. By a sword, I say. Bastard, someone sneaking about.
Can't just be the...
Look, the Tark! Oh, for a good bloody
It's clear.
Barrel of arrows in random directions. Don't even aim. Just draw and fire. Turn, draw, and fire.
That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How is that an effective combat strategy?
Who cares if it's effective? It keeps everyone on their toes.
You'll be rats again tonight. You all on a spit or in your soup?
On a spit. Choke
What you suppose the Witch King's gonna do with the Man City?
Probably raise it, then set it afire. Or maybe the other way around.
All this bother just so the boss shrieker can get some stone.
It's not just some stone like you pick up in the field, you glob. It's magic.
Then why don't the men use it to fight us? Huh? Tell me that. Getting tired of things sneaking about.
heard something over here. See
What has been done to you?
You've kept us waiting. Kept us waiting.
Free him!
Spider does not forfeit its prey, Ranger. Not unless a greater has set before it. I called you here for a reason. I called you here.
You will return him to me. Now.
You are brave. For a man. But it is not your sword that will save him. How much are you willing to sacrifice? To suffer. To suffer.
I have given up everything.
Not everything. Not yet.
You want the ring?
You would give me the ring for the wraith.
And find myself beside him in your web.
I am Shelob, and I deal only in truth. I wouldn't give it up either.
Wait.
Time now!
Take your price.
I'm impressed, Ranger. He must mean something to you. Go to your puppet before he dies.
You have doomed us, Talion. Her power was vast before, and now you have given her mine. I poured my life force into that ring.
Then we must take it back.
The war you came to fight is not here. The ring is lost. So look to Minas Ithil and the Dark Lord's armies that surround it. Look to the Palantir. Sauron will not stop until all of Middle-earth is dominated.
The Palantir must be protected. Miss Ethel. I must know if Shelob's vision holds true. The spider showed us the truth. Gondor's last fortress in Mordor cannot fall.
The Palantir is our concern. We must seize it before it falls into Sauron's hands. With it, his armies will be unstoppable. The fate of the city matters not.
I will not let them be slaughtered like my brothers at the Black Gate. We need to do something. Taking out the captain should buy the Gondorians some time.
And they could lead us to the Palantir. We must find a worm and make him talk.
Hide down here. What are we even waiting for?
There. His mind is weak.
What was that?
Who leads the search for the Palantir? The captain leading the search is in the lower city.
Then he will go no further. We need to do something. Taking out the captain should buy the Gondorians some time.
And they could lead us to the Palantir. We must find a worm and make him talk.
Time down here. What are we even waiting for?
There. His mind is weak. Who leads the search for the Palantir? The captain leading the search is in the lower city.
Then he will go no further.
Take the lower city and you're a grunt. Take the upper city and you're a king.
Palantir, Palantir. What do I know about city?
There's so much of Middle-earth I haven't seen. So much I've pillaged. Cities are wrecking, but what we do to Minas Tirith will make this place look brand new. Something smells foul around here. Fouler than me. Why don't these stinking pinkskins know when they're beaten?
Someone We'll throw their nobles from their own towers.
Human survivors are out there somewhere. We need to go and wipe them all out.
I don't like the sound of that. We've got a killer lurking around. Sword ready. Someone's gonna die for this. eyes open. Let's find whoever I'm hearing. The time has come for these wicked men to burn.
Fight for the middle city. Doesn't matter. When the final assault hits them, they'll fall, like all men. It's the Grave Walker! I thought he was dead.
He is!
Italian, the bow.
It doesn't look good for the Gondorians. We have to help.
The Palantir is a powerful artifact. If we were to possess it...
We could turn the tide.
Your mouth shut. Now we're stuck back in the rear instead of where the fighting is.
We need to target their captains. He's close.
The Wraith world will reveal his presence. Zugor.
It's round and it's blue. They call it the Seeing Stone. You see that, then you come running to me. Do not touch it. Now I'm gonna say that again. Do not touch it. If it does...
Zugor.
That not all paint skins smell the same. Aye, some smell delicious, others gag. I wonder what makes them all smell so different. Next time I defeat one, all Those shriekers go flying over your head, you can feel what real fear is. Yeah, imagine if you were on the other side.
Bogandor! You will die here, Orc!
See what you can find! Get out here!
Our city!
You big dog! Ranger! I've heard stories about you and your wraith. Stories about how you can't die. Well, let's find out if they're true. Slaughter him! You this! Oh, that there it comes! He's a tough one. Finish him!
I'd like to burn the whole city to the ground. And the Witch King these bombs.
Why are you out here alone?
My raiding party was trapped in the lower city overnight.
How many of you were there?
Not enough.
Well, Minas Ithil still stands.
We're about to lose the middle city, Ranger. They'll be closing the gate if they haven't already. We need to get up there as fast as we can.
I'll be right behind you. Wait! What is your name?
Idril.
Talia.
Don't fall behind, Talion. We've lost enough men today. Do you hear that, Ranger? They're closing the gate.
Then let's cut a path up there.
Sergeant Tarandor's going to need our help. Let's move.
Gondor will crush you! You want some? You thought we were dead.
I don't know who you are, but thank you.
Leave him out here.
This is just like Shelob's vision. If Sauron's forces get behind you, all of Middle-earth will share the same fate.
Not looking good.
Hasn't looked good for weeks.
Get closer, Trump. Closer.
Target the Ranger! I'm the little one!
Sergeant Dagon and his men are at the arena. We must aid them. Cut them down!
We've lost the middle city. Rally at the gate.
Keep moving. We'll cover your retreat.
Stay here and fight.
Retreat to the upper city.
Join us. The gate is closing.
We'll be right behind you.
Block the guy!
Ladies, talk!
The middle city is lost.
We're pulling back. Go! Go!
Chop your pieces!
Sergeant Dagon, we're pulling back. The middle city is lost.
Not before we finish these filthy drugs.
Kill you! I'll put you back in the dirt!
They're sealing the gate. Move out. Move out.
are you doing?
I won't be long. Go.
Have the archers provide support.
We've lost the Middle City. We made them pay for every inch of ground, but they now hold it.
Then our fate will be decided here. Our inner wall is our strongest. We have double their archer.
We cannot match the orcs for their numbers or ferocity.
Now, our people have held back Sauron's forces before.
But some things were lost forever.
Yes, of course they were. Go to the Great Hall. Secure the relics.
My place is here.
Make sure they are taken to Henathanon.
Is that an order?
You must understand. We must protect what is most precious
At all costs.
Yes.
We need to secure the Palantir now. The city is weak, and it will not hold for much longer.
But we cannot leave the Gondorians to their fate. Castamir is right. By protecting the city, we protect the Palantir.
Look.
The towers bear his mark.
Those were my towers once. Now Sauron's corruption spreads beyond the borders of Mordor. He mocks me.
They give him sight.
Not without the Palantir.
We will dismantle his hold on Minas Ithil. We will shift the tide of war.
I have no idea why I let talented people go on before me, honestly. I'm not a live performer, you know what I mean? I'm not a comedian, I'm not like some rapper or motivational speaker. And I didn't really know what I was going to do for the show. And so yeah, I don't blame you. But I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And then an archive link sort of dropped into my timeline. I don't even remember how I found it. But it was called the Library of Hate Facts. And I thought, why not? How much trouble can we get in, right? Like, it can't be that bad. If I say things that are apparently scientifically verifiable, it's okay. But before I start, what I want to say is these are statistics, and I don't want anyone to feel personally attacked. For example, if I pull a random one off the top of my head, like Scottish literacy rates or something. Oh, he's not even here. These are not talking about you, but these are apparently things that are true. There are some really interesting subjects here too. But they're all scientifically verifiable truths that go against the prevailing narratives. And the subjects we are presented with in the Library of Hate are Arabs and Islam, race, gender, diversity, ethnocentrism, intelligence, the validity of race, and other. I can just hear the nervous sweating. Everyone's like, oh shit. I'm not going to have time to cover all these topics, and Dev stole that from me. I sent him it. But these are not moral judgments about any individuals, so we'll begin with Arabs and Islam. Did you know that 87% of Egyptians, when polled, agreed with Al-Qaeda's goals? It gets better. Calm down. That's just the first one. Just calm down. Right. This comes from a 2009 study called Public Opinion in the Islamic World on Terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and U.S. Policies. Quote, majorities agree with nearly all Al-Qaeda's goals to change U.S. behavior in the Muslim world and promote Islamist governance and to preserve and affirm Islamic identity. However, there's a consistent rejection of general attacks on civilians. Only minorities say they approve of Al-Qaeda's attacks on Americans. So this is like democratic Islamism. It's like the Jeremy Corbyns of the Arab world. The end result's going to be great. But no, seriously, most of them, it is most of them, disagree that terror attacks on civilians are wrong, which is good. 85% of Egyptians at the highest, 60% of Pakistanis at the lowest. That's at least 40 of them are not sure. Like 40 of them are like, well, maybe attacks on civilians. But there are actually more disturbing statistics than that. That's 1 in 3 Palestinians has a favorable view of Al-Qaeda, as do 1 in 8 Muslims worldwide. 1 in 3 have a favorable view of Hamas. 1 in 9 had a favorable view of ISIS. This is in 2015. If the figure of 1.8 billion Muslims is correct, that's 200 million ISIS sympathizers across the Muslim world. But wait, there's more. The Muslim world's a really inbred place. Look, this comes from BBC Two's Newsnight. Thank you very much. Back in 2005, they don't publish stuff like this anymore. Despite being 3.4% of all births, British Pakistanis accounted for 30% of all regressive genetic disorders. And so this totals to apparently approximately 50% of the Muslim world that is inbred to some degree. I'm just quoting statistics, right? From the BBC. But we're not finished. Who are they getting married to? Anyone want to take a guess? Oh no, it's way worse than just their sisters, okay? 1 in 5 women in the Muslim world is married before they're 18. I didn't want to be the guy to say it. This was challenged in Pakistan recently, and the Council on Islamic Ideology, shot it down on the grounds that it was blasphemous. To raise the minimum age for marriage in Pakistan would have been anti-Islamic. And so there we'll leave the question of Islam and move on to something a little less controversial. Let's talk about race. Is this your first day? Because I'm not kidding. I have some seriously good stuff here. I dread to think what that 9-year-old's fucking search history looks like. So anyway, on the subject of race, apparently human beings are still evolving. Now, anyone who believes in evolution would naturally assume that, but it's actually been quite difficult for the scientific community to kind of push that forward because of ideology. As the New York Times reported, a New York Times reporter reported in a book, apparently around 15% of the human genome has been under selective pressures since the races of humans, as in the groups of humans on different areas and different continents, developed their own characteristics. 2,000 new genetic adaptations were discovered by the scientists from the University of Utah. The mutations relate to the brain, the digestive system, lifespan, immunity to pathogens, sperm production, and bones. Almost every aspect of our functioning, which is like, well, that's a Saturday night, isn't it? But these mutations, and this is where I'm going to get in trouble. Guess which continent they didn't happen on? Wrong! Yes. Yes. The scientific findings find that they happened everywhere except Africa. It is likely, as they say, quote, "It is likely the human races are evolving away from each other. We are getting less alike, not merging into a single mixed humanity. Diversity apparently is truly our strength." But it's okay. I know a lot of you might think, oh, Christ, I'm a bit nervous about where this is going, but it's all right. It turns out that literally everyone is racist, right from the point of birth. A study in 2007, produced by 2 scientists at the University of Missouri. Oh, God. It just found that basically we're all racist from birth and that it's automatic. Yeah. But it's all right. This racism manifests in our daily lives, and ladies, guess who's a bunch of racists? It ain't the men. So, a 2011 study for the academic journal Social Forces found that white, Latino, and Asian people are least open to dating outside of their race. Johnny's bucking that trend. Black people are most open to it. I see you on the move there. But this preference is gendered. Women are the ones who are least likely. Honestly, that's probably for the best. It's probably the Met Police listening. Women are the least likely to date outside of their race by a considerable margin. And the least desirable types of people, according to OkCupid, were Asian men and black females, which sounds like an amazing episode of Love Island, doesn't it? But naturally, this leads us to gender, because there just aren't enough groups to offend, apparently. We all know that men out-earn women, and one study in 2014 from Simon Fraser University found that it was simply that women are just less competitive. A 2008 study published by the American Psychological Association found that the higher a country's Human Development Index, the more different men and women become. And they said, it is proposed that heightened levels of sexual dimorphism result from personality traits of men and women being less constrained and more able to naturally diverge in developed nations. As in, the more free we become, the more free we are to be men or women, and the more different we are. Not too controversial yet. A 2009 study found that the more economically developed a nation, so basically the more free the nation is, the more self-segregated society becomes. Women apparently don't actually like hanging out with us guys. A 2011 study found that these gender roles deepened the wealthier and freer the country becomes. I suppose this must be because in 2013, Penn State University found that men and women are very different. Greater neural connectivity from front to back within one hemisphere of males suggested their brains are structured to facilitate connectivity between perception and coordinated action. In contrast, in females, the wiring goes from left to right hemispheres, suggesting they facilitate communication between the analytical and intuition. So scientifically, men and women's brains are different. And I love that it's taken, I mean, how many people is this? How much money is this to tell us what we already knew? Science also tells women, don't be a thought. This is where I'm going to get in trouble. I don't want anyone to feel personally attacked by this, okay? Structured to facilitate connectivity between perception and coordinated action. In contrast, in females, the wiring goes from left to right hemispheres, suggesting they facilitate communication between the analytical and intuition. So scientifically, men and women's brains are different. And I love that it's taken, I mean, how many people is this? How much money is this to tell us what we already knew? Science also tells women, don't be a thought. This is where I'm going to get in trouble. I don't want anyone to feel personally attacked by this, okay? Who's that simp? I tell you, there is nothing worse than simping, is there? It's the most despicable thing in the world. Women don't respect it, and everyone else wants to punch you. So, ladies, the more partners a woman has, the higher her chance of divorce. A woman with 20 sexual partners has an 80% chance of divorce. 40% of women with more than 20 sex partners has an STD. More sex partners increases the likelihood of drug and alcohol abuse. Apparently, stay-at-home wives are the ones who are happy. According to, this was just reported in Slate.com, a far-left rag, but this was back in 2006, presumably before they'd been taken over by a bunch of radicals. But yeah, no, science has found that stay-at-home wives are more content, and women who want equality with men are unhappy. As reported by the New York Times in 2007, modern women are less happy than their grandmothers. And a 2013 study by the University of Washington found that couples have more sex if the man abstains from doing household chores. I can't wait to show this to my wife. I'm just kidding, I don't do any chores. That's why she's always angry with me. Look, the way I look at it is like, look, darling, it's a race to the bottom, right? I am prepared to sit in the messiest house for a lot longer than you are. And if you want to make this into a competition, I have proof I'm more competitive, okay? So anyway, with women put back in the kitchen, let's talk about the gays. I'm gonna try and sound progressive when I say this, because like a 2001 study from the American Sociological Review found that contrary to the literature until the time, there were in fact differences in children raised by straight and gay parents. And this was overlooked because, well, I'll just give you the quote. They say, they explore findings from 21 studies and demonstrate that researchers frequently downplay findings indicating difference regarding children's gender and sexual preferences and behavior that could stimulate important theoretical questions. A less defensive, more sociologically informed analytic framework is proposed for investigating these issues, as in everyone is too afraid to tell you about what's going on. But I am used to being deplatformed, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it. It gets worse. I'm just going to blast through a bunch of these stats, because there is a lot here to talk about. So up to 90% of lesbian relationships report psychological abuse. 45% of lesbian relationships report physical abuse. Up to 50% of lesbians report being sexually abused by another woman. A 2001 study found that 7% of heterosexual men reported they had been molested as children, compared to 46% of homosexual men. 43% of gay men in the United States report having more than 500 partners. I can't believe that's the most controversial thing so far. Hey, look, hang on. What? 1 in 4. 1 in 4 gay men in the United States reports having more than 1,000 partners. Hey. 79% of gay men report that over half of their sexual partners are strangers. And presumably in unrelated statistics, gay men are 60 times more likely to have HIV than straight men. A 2016 study found that 99.8% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual teens change their sexual orientation within 13 years. 2/3 of both gays and lesbians will end up in heterosexual relationships. Syphilis has nearly been eradicated in the US, but despite being 1% of the population, gay men account for 63% of all cases of syphilis. Sexually active homosexual men are 17 times more likely to have anal cancer than straight men. Yeah, right? And it turns out that monogamy is essentially something that doesn't exist in the gay community. Yeah, I know. Jesus. I don't know if I'm going to be brave enough to put this up on my channel, to be honest. It turns out that 4.5 to 9% of men, gay men, report being monogamous. Gay men are 50% more likely to divorce than straight men. Lesbians are 200% times more likely to divorce. 200% more likely to divorce, and gay men are 10 to 15 times more likely to have an eating disorder. Lesbians are twice as likely, and 2.5 times more likely to be obese. And I told you not to feel personally attacked. And since the next statistics are for mental disorders, we'll move on to transsexuality. Okay, look, I'm not joking. I probably won't I'll put this on BitChute or something. Yeah, I wish I could. So, 88% of children who have gender dysphoria do not hold those beliefs when they become adults. 12% of boys who believe they are transsexuals still believe that they do when they grow up. So, transsexual college students are 5 times more likely than all other students to have an eating disorder. 53% of mothers of transsexual children have borderline personality disorder, compared to just 6% of mothers of children who are not. Up to 85% of transsexuals are currently being treated for depression or anxiety, and 44% show signs of clinical depression. 41% of transsexuals have tried and failed to commit suicide, and transsexuals who undergo sex reassignment surgery are more likely. 65% of transsexual youth have seriously considered suicide within the last year, and 1 in 10 has attempted suicide more than 3 times in the last year. And only 21% of transsexuals can apparently pass successfully as the opposite gender. And I think what we'll do is we'll leave the library of hate there for a while. But the question is, why did I bring all of this up? And there is actually a good reason to bring all of this up, because these are all things that you didn't know, because of the narrative about the things that you're being told. There is a real problem with presenting one side as if it is only good and presenting the other side as if it's only bad, because it gives you a completely misinformed view of the world, and it makes you think that things that have consequences don't have consequences. These things are kept from you. And I think one of the things that I'll leave it on is a bit of advice. Go and next time you're on Google, just get your phones and look up transgender regret stories, sex change regret stories. And these are some of the most brutal things that you've ever read. And once you've read them, you realize why it might be advisable that people know the downsides of something as well as the upsides. But thanks very much.
Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mr. Shock. First of all, thank you very, very, very much for being here. I've been following your work for a long time now, and I'm very appreciative of you and very appreciative of everything you've done. And I've been fascinated by the subject of ancient Egypt. So I'm really excited, very psyched.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about your show. I've heard a lot about you. My, of course, the late John Anthony West, I think, was on with you a couple of times, maybe.
Yeah.
He was very proud that, I guess, you did the only full Skype interview with him.
Yeah, that's the only one I've ever done is with him.
Yeah, he used to like to talk about that. So,
well, I just had to talk to him, and he was in upstate New York at the time, and it was just he really didn't have any plans to come down here, and I was very fortunate to one day get him in studio, though. It was really nice.
So it's been wonderful.
Well, his work, that DVD series that he did, Magical Egypt, was amazing.
Yeah.
And I had seen your work before that in that Mysteries of the Sphinx thing that was narrated by Charlton Heston.
Charlton Heston, NBC, 1993. I think in many ways it was the Mystery of the Sphinx that really broke everything open. It brought everything to the public attention. I've had many people tell me, I'm not trying to brag or anything, I'm just saying factually, that this really opened up a new field, if we could put it that way, a new way of looking at things in the among the popular public, press, the popular media, but people around the world versus the academic scholarly journals and the back and forth, that type of thing. You have to remember, I'm a faculty member. I'm at Boston University. I'm an academic. And many of the academics have poo-pooed, should we say, over the years, bringing things to the public, but I think it's been important to do.
Now, what we're talking about for the people that are uninformed is the idea that some of the structures in ancient Egypt are far older than conventional wisdom or conventional modern-day archaeology, modern-day Egyptologists. They would like us to believe that all of this spawned from a very specific time period. And people like John Anthony West and yourself and some other folks like Graham Hancock are proposing that it's entirely possible that there were many different eras of construction in Egypt and that there are some structures that are far, far older than we think.
Yeah, exactly. And this, what I was alluding to, is this really opened up with our work on redating the Great Sphinx.
Yes.
And I think you know the story, but maybe just to summarize in the smallest of nutshells, John Anthony West, before I met him, he became a follower, should we say, or I shouldn't say follower because that sounds wrong. That sounds like it's a religion dogma. But he became interested in the work of the late Schwaller de Lubitsch, who passed away in 1961, but he had mentioned in one line that the Sphinx had been weathered by rain, I would say precipitation, as a geologist, not wind and sand. So this, if it were true, and it is true, would put the Sphinx back to a much earlier period, which would tie in with Schwaller's work and John Anthony West's subsequent work, that there were indications that dynastic Egypt, as we know it, going back to about 3000 BC, was really a legacy of what I call now an earlier cycle of civilization, something that goes back much, much earlier, which at this point I date back to the end of the last ice age. Ice age ended 9700 BC, just to put it in perspective for people.
So when did you first get on board with this? Did John Anthony West come to you? Or
John Anthony West, okay, so the story goes this way. John Anthony West published Serpent in the Sky, his probably most famous book, first edition, 1979. He was then looking for someone that could really validate or at least assess from a scientific point of view this theory about the Sphinx, which he had just barely sort of touched the surface based on Schwaller that maybe it could be older, but this was really a geological question. He mentions that in 1979 in Serpent in the Sky. John Anthony West went on to become very involved with Egypt, and he started traveling to Egypt. He led tours to Egypt. He wrote The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt in 1985, also mentions in appendix, I think it was, just the, quote, older Sphinx theory, but really looking for someone to at least assess it scientifically. He met a fellow in Egypt, actually, at the time, Robert Eddy, who is PhD English literature, I believe, something like that. But he was teaching in Cairo, American University in Cairo, I believe. Then he came to Boston University. This is late 1980s. I was and still do teach at Boston University full time. Robert Eddy and myself got to know each other. Robert Eddy mentioned me as a geologist to John Anthony West, and that maybe this was someone who seems fairly knowledgeable, fairly open-minded about things.
Now, at the time, did you have any thoughts on Egypt or the dating?
My interest in Egypt goes way back. I was reading about ancient Egypt when I was literally 6, 7, 8 years old. I had a grandmother who had a wonderful library at the time, and I would go through her library. She had books from the British Museum on ancient Egypt going back to the turn of the century. So I was prepared in the sense I was open to such things, but I didn't imagine getting involved in Egypt in any way professionally.
Did you have any thoughts about the dating of the Sphinx or the pyramids or anything back then before you looked into it?
Yeah, there were two things. So there were two things going on in my head back then, which maybe prepped me for this. Number one, I knew the conventional story. I knew that the Sphinx goes back to 2500 BC, according to the standard Egyptologists. In 1989, which is when I believe it was 1989, I first actually met West in person. I had in my mind that the Egyptologists must be correct because they've studied it, they must know what they're doing. I was coming from an academic point of view. I'm just giving, saying where I'm coming from.
Right.
I had gone to Yale University to get my PhD in geology and geophysics. I was very well grounded in, quote, the status quo academic point of view. So I thought when I first went to Egypt, I would just prove West wrong. I would just prove that the Egyptologists knew what they were talking about. But, and this is an important but, I was also trained in many ways, both as a graduate student and going back to my grandmother, who I had great respect for, and was also very, should we say, liberal and open-minded, but critical. You always have to follow the evidence wherever it goes, and that's always been my rule of thumb, that not everything is always the way people say it is, even if they're, quote, authorities. And something I already knew when I went to Egypt for the first time was that some of the very old Egyptologists in the late 19th, early 20th century had actually suggested that just the way it looks, the feel of the Sphinx, not based on hard evidence really, that maybe it was older than the pyramids, that maybe it goes back earlier. So I felt that it wasn't all said and done and, pat and sound that the Egyptologists necessarily knew what they were talking about in modern times, because some of the earlier Egyptologists, who they held in very high respect supposedly, had said different things. Secondly, and I hate to bring this up, but I will because it's part of the background, my grandmother, who I mentioned a second ago, was a theosophist. And if you know anything about theosophy, it also suggests that, maybe there's things that go back earlier.
What is a theosophist?
A theosophist, it's how do I explain it? Have you heard of Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky?
No.
No, okay. Whoop, I'm losing my headphones. Theosophy was founded in the late 19th century. It questioned a lot of the materialistic values, a lot of the dogma of science of the time, of religion of the time. It looked to the East in particular, to other philosophies, other worldviews. So basically, it was a way. This is what it did for me, at least. And I'm not a theosophist. I don't want to say I'm a theosophist. But reading theosophical works on top of everything else allowed me, I think, to expand my horizons and to see that maybe the dogma of the day is just that, the dogma of the day, that there are other possibilities. And not that we accept something just because someone said it or because it's old or because it's this religion or that religion or that's supposed to be ancient culture. But no, you keep everything open, you look at the evidence. And that's really where I was coming from. But my point is that even in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I first got involved with this, if I looked at it critically, the evidence was not that definitive for the age of the Sphinx. So I was going in with open-minded possibilities, but honestly, when I first went to Egypt with John Anthony West in 1990, I thought, before I got off the plane, that this would be simple, open and shut case. I would prove him wrong in the sense of his assertions that maybe the Sphinx was older. I had no doubt at the time that my colleagues in Egyptology must know what they're talking about, and all of that changed literally within 30, without exaggerating, 30 to 120 seconds of first seeing the Sphinx. Yeah, it really did.
What was your first impression?
Because my first impression of the Sphinx was, now that I saw it on the ground, in person, there was something wrong with the Egyptological dating. Because when you look at the Sphinx, as a geologist with a geological eye, this was not weathered by wind and sand. This was not desert erosion and weathering that I saw on the Sphinx, the body of the Sphinx, which is very difficult to tell because it's been heavily repaired and reworked, but particularly on the walls of what are known as the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx enclosure is important because it preserves a lot of the details. And if the audience has not been to Egypt, they should realize that when they carved the Sphinx, it's all solid bedrock. Only the head initially was above the ground surface. They carved down into the rock to free up the body, what I call the core body of the Sphinx. And it's that core body and the walls of the enclosure, more or less the quarry around it, if you want to use that term, that show these ancient weathering, precipitation, erosional features that are incompatible with the last 5,000 years of climatic history on the eastern edge of the Sahara. So immediately I knew there was something wrong geologically, had to figure that out. Either this was a weird geological anomaly or something else was going on and the Sphinx might go back to an earlier period. Also, I want to point out that when you look at the Sphinx, and other geologists have looked at this as well, they did not just chip away at the rock to carve the body. More or less, you could have chipped away at the rock with pickaxes and that type of thing, shoveled out chips of rock in baskets. That would have been the easy way. What they did is they carved out huge blocks of stone. And when I say huge, we're talking multi-ton, tens of tons, some of them maybe over 50 tons or more of limestone. They moved those due east of the Sphinx and built what is now known as the Sphinx Temple, which is still there in ruinous condition, and the Valley Temple. So you had these two huge temples. And what is interesting, a lot of people don't realize this or they don't think about it. I think those constructions, which are contemporary with the oldest portion of the Sphinx, in some ways are more impressive if you think about the technology and what went into constructing them than the age of the Sphinx itself. So it's not just the Sphinx, it's also these limestone temples that are associated with it and were built contemporaneously.
So Jamie pulled up two photos here. The first one that he pulled up was a computer image that showed the Sphinx and showed...
Okay, I'm looking at it now, yes. And in this image, what you can see, that's a computer image that's actually from Mystery of the Sphinx. And then there's an inset that's an aerial photograph, the real thing. And that shows how when they were carving the body, they cut out huge blocks and then put them in position to make what's known as the Sphinx Temple, due east of the Sphinx.
And the second image is the Sphinx Temple?
Okay, and you look at this, it says the Sphinx faces due east, the rising sun, and right in front of it is the Sphinx Temple. So this is a humongous temple made out of these huge blocks of stone, which were carved out when they carved the body of the Sphinx. And here you see in this image another picture of the Sphinx Temple.
And so these erosion
and
features that you're looking at here.
And you can see how big they are. You can see how big they are. They're enormous. Okay, these erosion features on the blocks, don't worry about them for the moment.
Okay.
Let's go back to the Sphinx enclosure itself. It's a Sphinx enclosure where you see the rolling, undulating profile, the erosional features. Here you see it in that picture, the vertical fissures, and I know you're familiar with this personally because I've heard you talk about it with John Anthony West, that can only be caused by precipitation. The rocks are like a layer cake, so it takes out the softer layers, it recedes the softer layers, some of the harder layers stick out further, but the water also finds its way down crevices and cracks, natural features that are slightly softer, and it forms these vertical fissures. I want to make the point because a lot of people get confused. They say, couldn't it be rising Nile floods? No. Geologically, that would give a very different signature on the rock. It's not floods coming up from the bottom. It's actually precipitation and rainfall runoff coming from above.
And rainfall for thousands of years?
Well, there's two aspects here. It could be thousands of years. It could be much stronger rainfall, huge flash floods, that type of thing. And part of the story that I hope we'll get to is that initially, I'm jumping around here a little bit.
No worries.
But initially, I was thinking 5,000 to 7,000 BC. That was very conservative based on the geological data, based on the seismic, which we have to get to also. But now I believe we're talking prior to 9,700 BC for the original construction of the Sphinx, and we can talk about why the dating. And at 9,700 BC, we have the end of the Younger Dryas, the end of the glacial epoch, the end of the last ice age. I have now put together the story based on evidence. And whenever if I say I believe something or I think something, it's always based on evidence that I've been piecing together, that what we had ending the Younger Dryas, ending the last ice age, was a huge eruption from the sun, a huge solar outburst, huge climatic changes, which put, among other things, a lot of precipitation, a lot of moisture into the air, which came down as precipitation with huge floods, huge essentially thunderstorms, et cetera. And I think a lot of the initial erosion that we still see on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure go back to that period. So you had the situation where you would get this incredible weathering and erosion, and then it continued for thousands of years after that and was reinforced until you had the Sahara coming in relatively recent times, in geologically Holocene times.
The Sahara Desert,
the Sahara Desert, yes.
So before that, it was some sort of a rainforest.
It's savanna to rainforest. It actually varied over time, and before that, it was very fertile savanna, lots of plants there. People have seen it even in popular movies and whatnot, how the Sahara at one point had water and all kinds of animals. That's before the end of the last ice age, before these incredible changes that we have at 9,700 BC. So that's where the Sphinx, I think the original Sphinx, goes back to that time period, and that's what the Egyptians called Zep-Tepi. This was a first time for them, or what I call an earlier cycle of civilization. The last cycle, the one that we're still part of, in my terminology, is the last 5,000 years. So civilization arising, re-emerging, I should say, about 3,000 to 4,000 BC, coming into really what we have now, high technology, et cetera. But before that, there had been earlier cycle of civilization that was essentially snuffed out or brought to its knees, if you would, by the end of the last ice age. And just to map this out, a period from about 9700 BC, this is what I'm reconstructing now, to about 4000 to 3000 BC, where we have civilization reemerging. Between that period, so thousands of years, 9700 BC to say 3700 BC for round numbers, 6,000 years, we have essentially a dark period, and what I've been now calling SIDA, solar-induced dark age. Sort of ironic, the sun would induce a dark age because it brought civilization back to an earlier stage, if you would.
I'm not sure I follow that. How did the sun do this?
Solar outburst, essentially coronal mass ejection,
Right.
huge eruption, bigger than anything we've ever seen
And
on
so
Earth.
that's what
and
caused these massive thunder showers, and
exactly
nothing in modern history. has
Nothing
any
in
record.
modern history is even close to this, but we do have isotope data, etc., that indicates this has happened in the past at the end of the last ice age, and I'm sure it's happened many times over. And you have a lot of markers that indicate this. You have vitrification of rock. In fact, a lot of the markers, and I don't want to be debating the issue necessarily, but a lot of the markers that people have used for a comet at the Younger Dryas or during the Younger Dryas, really most of them are at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. That's what they're claiming, but a lot of the dating is very, very iffy. I found it interesting, for instance, someone will use something as a marker for the Younger Dryas, and it will give a date of 12,000 plus or minus 4,000 years. So, this is just the way geology is. But I remember, and I can't remember his name, you had a guest on one of your shows. He was when...
Randall Carlson?
Not Randall Carlson. I know Randall very well. He was on with Carlson and Shermer, and but he came on by Skype.
Yes.
Malcolm?
I do not remember his name.
Okay, but anyway,
Yeah.
he was one of the people that was, quote, comet proponent, and he started pointing out a lot of the evidence, microspherules, glassy spheres, nanodiamonds. I don't think he mentioned, but I'll mention shocked quartz, etc. And everyone has been assuming this has to be from a physical impact in the sense of something coming down, like a comet or an asteroid, that type of thing. But the problem is you don't necessarily find craters. You don't necessarily find the pieces of the comet. You should find some physical remains. And he mentioned, and I found it very interesting, he mentioned in passing what I've been working on now for a number of years, that no, and I was once on the comet bandwagon, I'll put it that way, and I'm not trying to knock good research. But when you look at the evidence, what is not being considered by a lot of people, and he mentioned this is in passing, he said, well, something else that could cause is lightning. But you wouldn't have lightning, that's very localized. We think of this as very localized.
Right.
But if you have a major solar outburst, major coronal mass ejections, and an astrophysicist who's now deceased, he was at Cornell, Thomas Gold, who did a lot of really good, in fact, prize-winning work in astrophysics, first pointed out in the 1960s that if you have a major solar outburst, major coronal mass ejection, you would get essentially huge, what would be like huge lightning strikes over incredible areas of the Earth simultaneously. This would cause vitrification. It would cause all these features. And just as within the last year, there's been more work done showing that fulgurites, where lightning strikes in modern times, even small lightning strikes like that can create things like shocked quartz, other, quote, impact features that people have always said, well, it must be a comet or an asteroid. But you're not finding the craters. You're not finding other things. So what I'm finding, or my own research, is I'm coming to conclude that it wasn't a physical object that hit us. It was a solar outburst. That's the general term I use.
Is it possible that it was both?
Actually, it's quite possible that it could have been both. Yeah, there could have been fragments of both. I can address that. And there's a couple of aspects to both. When you say both, there's indications that comets diving into the sun actually cause coronal mass ejections that correlate it with
Oh, wow.
disturbing the sun. So in some cases, you'll have I'll call it the comet group, talking about how we go through these comet streams periodically. I agree 100%. In fact, I talk about this in some of my early books because I really was into comets at the time. Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, for instance, I talk about how comets might have begun and ended the Younger Dryas. But I wasn't thinking about solar activity at that time seriously, as no one else was. But we now find that comets diving into the sun, when we go through comet streams, that can set off solar activity. So in fact, I think it could be both, but it could be that the comets are affecting the sun, which is then affecting the Earth, rather than directly, if that makes sense.
Yes, okay.
And the other thing is that people have to understand there's a couple of things going on. The Younger Dryas, 10,900 BC, when it first begins, is a cooling period. It's not as dramatic a climate change as you have at 9,700 BC, when all of a sudden we go from deep ice age climatic regime to modern, or even a little bit warmer initially, modern changes. And
So this is it.
There we have some isotope data. And what we have at 9,700 BC, and this is based on sediment cores and ice cores. We also have lunar data that supports this. At 9,700 BC, we have incredible climatic change going from deep ice age to modern warming. And this literally now, based on what they call microstratigraphy from Greenland ice cores, can be dated within, get this, weeks to days.
Wow.
So this happened literally, we're talking virtually overnight. When I was a graduate student, we thought things happened suddenly. We were talking thousands of years or decades. Oh, God, decades for something to happen geologically. That'd be crazy.
Right.
Now we're talking literally weeks to days.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So I think this ties in or supports that there was a massive solar event in 9,700 BC. What we had just on a slide a minute ago when I sought out the side of my eye was a graph of, based on isotope data, what they call proxies, of solar activity, again based on primarily ice cores, sediment cores, and the sun was incredibly active in 9,700 BC and shortly after there, and it had huge, if you think of it anthropomorphically, mood swings where it'd be very active, then it would go very still, then very active again, very still. And this happened for some thousands of years, and then it evened out. The sun sort of became quiescent. It was during this quiescence period that, tying back into human civilization was able to reemerge, redevelop again. And we've had incredibly good conditions, should we say, for the last 5,000 years, quiet conditions, stable conditions on Earth for civilization to reemerge, tying it back into that theme. But recently, the sun has become very active again, and we have to be very careful. I'm not a doomsayer or scaremonger. I'm not trying to sell people on being preppers. But the reality is the sun has started to become active again, just as it was at the end of the last ice age. And I think this makes perfect sense because the sun is a star. It goes through cycles like other stars do, and we're a little planet orbiting it, and we're, like all the other planets, affected by the sun.
It's fascinating, though, that we have this incredible need to keep things exactly the way they are, to the point where we're in denial about any potential change. Even if you're studying things, everybody's like, oh, it'll be fine. We're so inclined to dismiss.
We're so inclined to do that. It's very Aristotelian. And in fact, I forget who it was. One of the astrophysicists some decades ago said about the sun, it was sort of the last vestige of Aristotelianism in modern science. Everyone assumed the sun is stable, essentially perfect. Yes, it goes through little sun cycles of 11 and 22 years and maybe some bigger ones of a few centuries. But no one wanted to think of it as what it is, just a plain old star that goes through periods of the equilibrium. We've been in relative solar equilibrium for thousands of years now, but it goes through disequilibrium and has, we'll call it hiccups and spurts, and has to recalibrate itself, if you would. And we feel the effects on Earth. And so at the end of the last ice age, we had this massive solar event, solar outburst, what they call solar proton events. It would have messed up the ionosphere, caused all kinds of geomagnetic storms. This ties in with earthquake activity that we see at the end of the last ice age, because we now have lots of evidence that solar activity upsets the magnetosphere and the magnetic fields on the Earth, the electrical currents in the Earth. It's will trigger earthquakes that are about to happen anyway, not unlike, I was talking to Katie, my wife, on the ride here, and a good analogy is when you have an avalanche that's just about ready to go, you can clap your hands in some cases, and it sets off this huge avalanche.
Really?
Yeah, so solar activity is tied in with earth activity, earthquake activity, for instance, volcanic activity. So we see volcanic activity, increased volcanic activity. There was a major supervolcano that went off just at the end of the last ice age. Well, why? Probably, and this is me speaking, because of the solar activity that set it off. So when you start getting things like platinum and iridium and osmium spikes, that's not necessarily extraterrestrial. That could be from terrestrial volcanic activity that was occurring at that period. So yes, there's extraterrestrial causes, but I think that there's a very strong case to be made that this is solar, that this is the sun influencing us, which is really important too. Fast forward to today, here we are, we're on Skype, we're using all these electronic media. What could be more vulnerable to a solar outburst?
That kind of stuff, yeah. Our power grid.
Power grids will be fried. There was and I think we're seeing the beginning of this, or we saw the beginning of this, because again, I'm a geologist, so I think in broad terms, a few hundred years is nothing. 1859. Are you aware of the Carrington event?
No.
There was a major solar outburst from a human perspective, major solar outburst. From an astrophysical perspective, it was nothing. But it was a coronal mass ejection, actually 2 in a row, that hit us in 1859. It's known as the Carrington event after Richard Carrington, who first saw the solar flares, the really bright solar flares that were associated with it. It was picked up on the primitive magnetometers of the time that they had, for instance, in London, et cetera, studied by the physicists of the time. And 1859, there were electronics around. It was called the telegraph system. The telegraph system acted as huge antenna that picked up the changing magnetic fields, generated electricity along it, burnt out the telegraph lines, literally set telegraph the places where the telegraph operators worked on fire, telegraph stations on fire, that type of thing. If we had a Carrington level event now, which is really quite minor from a astrophysical perspective, orders of magnitude less than what happened at the end of the last ice age, it would fry our grid lines. It would knock out all the huge transformers. It would, before it did that, as it's coming in, it would probably knock out all the satellites, the GPS systems, communications. I mean, it would really bring us to our knees.
Is this an article, Jamie, from 1859?
Yeah.
The auroral display in Boston is another display of auroral.
Yeah.
Bright,
there you go.
Brilliant at 1 o'clock, ordinary print can be read by the light.
Exactly, because one thing you get is these bright auroras, these bright, what people think of as the northern and southern lights, but in 1859 they saw them around the world. Back at the end of the last ice age, because they were so powerful, when they become more intense, they take on very discrete structures in the sky. Here's some what are known as, again, northern lights, auroral displays. But see how it starts to take on a discrete structure on the right there. And to describe it to the audience, do you see how it sort of looks like a person with their hands up in the air? They start to take on more and more discrete structures. Some of them look like people with their hands up in the air and little legs. And some of them
what exactly
take on
is this
birds'
phenomenon?
This is basically the high-charged particles, electrons and protons and whatnot, interacting with the atmosphere. And they form these figures. It's electrical phenomenon. And they will ultimately come down. If you have a dense enough one, as you did at the end of the last ice age, it will look like if you were there living, 12,000 years ago, 10,000, 11,700 years ago at the end of the last ice age, and you saw this, you would see these things in the sky. Oh, they look like gods. They look like stick figure humans in the sky. You would see huge lightning bolts hitting parts of the surface of the Earth.
That image is fascinating because that image that's in hieroglyphics and all sorts of...
Exactly. You find this around the world, and Anthony Perrott, who's
Explain what we're looking at for the people that are, because a lot of people are just listening.
Okay, what we're looking at
plasma discharge formation.
Yeah, this is plasma discharge formation. Plasma is essentially, think of it as electrically charged particles, electrons, protons, that type of thing. As it comes off the sun, in this case, think of a coronal mass ejection, a huge ball of charged gas is one way to describe it, hitting the atmosphere, driving down into the atmosphere, causing these like northern lights on steroids, if you want to put it that way.
And the images that we're seeing
takes on very specific images that look like stick figures. So these are things you would see in the sky, except in many cases they're spinning electrically. You wouldn't notice that they were spinning necessarily.
Back,
and they look sort of like, because we tend to anthropomorphize, we tend to look at like even clouds or rocks formations, and we make them look like what we think they look like. So they look sort of like stick figure men.
And is any of this an actual photograph, or are these just graphic illustrations?
These are graphic illustrations, but what we can show, no, because we haven't experienced this, fortunately, and since photography, but what we do have are petroglyphs dating back to the end of the last ice age, where people were seeing this in the sky, and they were drawing it on the walls of caves, on the walls of rocks, and globally. Anthony Perrott, who's a Los Alamos plasma physicist, he is the world's expert on this type of high-energy plasma physics. These are some of the illustrations.
Go back, Jamie. Oh, look at this from all over the world. Look at this.
Exactly.
Amazing.
All over the world.
Arizona, Italy. It's all the same thing.
It's all the same thing. And notice, too, that
Spain.
See how they look like stick figures, but they have little weird dots on their side, donuts? Real humans don't have that. But they're seeing this around the world in the sky and recording it. Also, the motif of when these take on certain forms, they take on what look like birds' heads. So the bird-headed man, a motif that you see around the world going back. And I believe it all goes back to the end of the last ice age and what people were experiencing, what they were seeing, if you want to call it gods in the sky or whatever. But they were seeing this, and it was having a real effect on their life.
What is causing that very specific pattern, that very specific shape that you're seeing with the two dots?
The way I would say it, the best way to say it is you've got this is simplistic, but you've got these huge electrical charges coming down. They sort of focus like a tornado focuses. Or if you think of running water out of a spigot, if you play with it, you can sort of squeeze it and make it form different shapes. That's sort of my analogy to it. And it's the magnetic and electric fields interacting with each other. Sometimes they sort of spin around each other like a rope.
And in that illustration here, you see, how do you say his name? Perrott?
Perrott, yeah.
Dr. Perrott's experiments, where he essentially reproduced that shape over and over and over again.
That's right, exactly.
Wow.
He reproduced that. And then it gets even more fascinating, and this is something that ties in actually with Katie, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, and Perrott's team has confirmed it. On Easter Island, you have the Rongo script, which also duplicates this and seems to be a record. The modern Rongo are only a few hundred years old, but just like any manuscript or anything, it was copied over and over and seems to go back to it too. And if you look at some of the Rongo, and I know a lot of your audience can't see this, but you look at some of them, they're even more definitive, showing what Perrott was able to reproduce experimentally, and there they have it, recorded from ancient times.
So when you're talking about this event that happened at the end of the Younger Dryas, put it in perspective. Like, are we talking about like a hurricane times 1,000? Like, what would this be like with these thunderstorms?
A million.
A million.
Yeah, like huge thunderstorms. Yeah. I mean, literally.
Impossible to comprehend.
Impossible to comprehend from our point of view.
From our perspective.
Yeah, our perspective. And there's more to it than that. You would have incredible radiation levels at the surface of the Earth. Paul LaVioletta, a physicist I know, and he's published on this, has talked about how during an event like this, you would have levels of radiation that were so high that large mammals, we are large mammals. Large mammals, if they couldn't protect themselves, they could die within 3 to 6, 7 days, a week or so. How do you protect yourself? You go underground, you go into caves, you go into places, because rock will protect you from the surface radiation under these circumstances.
Wow.
Now, you don't need to stay there forever. You can, because these solar events probably came. Now, this is hypothetical because we've not experienced a huge one like this, but they probably came, and then it would back off a little bit, but then maybe another one would come. I'm a geologist, so think of a huge earthquake and then aftershocks. Aftershocks that can actually last centuries or millennia in some cases, smaller ones. So something that was happening, and you see this around the world too, is that where people survived, I believe in part, because they had access to natural caves initially, then they built underground structures for when they came again, and it also encouraged or developed this whole tradition, should we say, of having a place to go. Even if it's not occurring at the moment, they knew that these things do occur, at least for some thousands of years, and we're aware of this, so we're being prepared. An analogy I would use is during the Cold War here, what did a lot of people build in their backyards?
Bunkers.
Bunkers. Yeah. So they were doing this also. So you get areas here. I see there's a slide of India up at the moment. Cappadocia region is very well known for this.
How did they know to get underground? How did they know to get into caves?
I think initially, I mean, you've got literally fire coming down from the sky. Think of the lightning bolts fire.
Right.
I mean, if you've got a cave there, you go into it.
It's the only thing that's going to protect you.
Yeah, it protects
Teepees
you.
and houses are useless.
Oh,
right.
yeah, all that burns. I mean, you've got literally fire coming down. Think of it as fire, lightning.
Yes.
That is going to set things on fire.
And you're
literally
talking about
incinerate.
But just lightning everywhere.
Yeah.
Almost like rainfall.
Yes,
Wow.
in certain areas. And that's why you have huge sheets of glass in some cases.
Wow. So that's, wow.
Yeah. And so you're incinerating everything. Where it hits ice, it's flash vaporizing it.
Right.
It's hitting water. It's vaporizing it.
So this is causing massive flooding.
So it's causing massive flooding. It's dumping all the ice ultimately into the oceans, which is causing rising sea levels. But more importantly, it's causing massive precipitation, massive flash floods.
And what kind of population loss are we talking about? In terms
I think
of human
incredible.
beings?
I think incredible because, for instance, we can document linguistically, and this is other people's work, but I think it ties right in. They haven't been able to explain it cogently otherwise, that there is, for instance, in Turkey, Middle East, there is a constriction of the population to the Anatolia region, Cappadocia, where you have these underground shelters. You have a geology that was easy to go into and escape. And linguistically, we can map back Indo-European languages to a small pocket that survived there at the end of the last ice age.
Wow.
So, I think there was a massive, around the world, you would have had populations being constricted and then they spread out again. And when they were constricted, I see the slide there for the linguistic data. When you constrict down in one area, of course, you lose a lot of the technology. You lose a lot of the high culture, if you would.
Right.
You go back to a much more primitive stage, and that's what we find. So we find, for instance, in Anatolia, Western Turkey, near Asia, as it was called, in ancient times, you find not only, of course, things like Göbekli Tepe, which goes back before this huge catastrophe with the monumental stone megaliths, etc. But what you find there 2,000 years later in the same general area, you find, for instance, Çatalhöyük, which is a bunch of mud brick houses all clustered together. It's gone down. It's gone into what I call, Katie and I call Siddha, this solar-induced dark age, where they lost a lot of it. Not unlike an analogy, and I think it's easy for people to understand analogies, the end of the Roman Empire and everything that was lost there, and then going into a much more primitive state with the Dark Ages, the European Dark Ages in this case. You look at the technology, it was much higher during the Roman Empire until maybe 1000 or 1200 AD again in many realms. Same thing here, although this was such a mighty throwback, it took thousands of years for people to reemerge and at least start to get up to the status
now,
where they
have
had
you
been before.
Presented this in front of other scholars and
Yes,
people,
yes.
and how are they?
Well, there's a lot of resistance. Look, I'm an academic. I don't want to sound the wrong way. I'm not looking for sympathy, but going out on limbs like this, beginning with the redating of the Sphinx, and that's what we didn't even finish with that yet.
Right. We'll
but
get
that's
back to
okay.
that.
We'll get back to that.
We got plenty of time.
Yeah. There's a lot of resistance to anything that's new, any concepts, new ideas.
Textbooks have already been written.
Textbooks have been written. People have staked their
PhDs have been given out. Yeah.
Yeah, they've staked their reputation on it, and I understand that, and I try not to be that myself. This is my pet theory.
Right.
But I do try to look at the evidence. I think that slowly we're building up more and more interest, more and more, at least people looking at it objectively. And I do see changes occurring. One thing I'll mention right now is, as of relatively recently, now it's still very, very small, but at Boston University, I've been allowed to found what is called the ISOC, the Institute for the Study of the Origins of Civilization, which is really just me at the moment. But I want to build it up, and I'd like to get, I'm not trying to sound the wrong way, but I'd like to get people to donate to it, et cetera, et cetera. Also, I've found it with some colleagues of mine, including some academic colleagues, Oracle, which stands for the Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures. So we're bringing it into the mainstream, both as a private not-for-profit foundation, as an institute through Boston University, to really be looking at these things in a, when I say professional way, what I mean by that is, evidence-based way, but also looking outside the standard dogmas, the standard box, the standard paradigms, and the standard vested interest. Because so much science, people say to me all the time, they think science is supposed to be objective. Well, maybe it is supposed to be objective, but who are the scientists doing it? They have all their subjective biases and notions and vested interest. And I'm not trying to knock anyone, but
it's a fact. And it's just a human fact.
Yeah, we're all humans.
And one of the things that happened in that documentary from 1993 that I was kind of stunned by was the reaction by the conventional Egyptologist when you brought up this evidence, where he was very dismissive, almost mockingly, in this weird sort of a way, where he was like, what culture? Where's this culture? Where's the evidence of this culture?
Absolutely. And
it's kind of gross.
It is, because that really should not have any place in
science.
Mocking,
right? He was
with
mocking
and being called. I mean, I've been called a pseudoscientist.
Yes.
Look, I don't want to sound the wrong way, but I think I'm as well credentialed as anyone.
Yes.
I mean, among my academic colleagues,
Well, that's why I appreciate that you have stuck your neck out for so long doing this research. But since that time,
have I been punished? Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah,
in some ways.
let's. No, I'll be honest. I haven't gotten necessarily the. I've had colleagues say to me, in no uncertain terms, very well-meaning, that I could have had a wonderful career and had all the promotions and advancements going up through the academic ladder, if you would, with no problems if I just stuck to my, some little specialty that no one really cared about.
But you've had an impact, a gigantic impact on people like me that are really fascinated by this stuff.
If I had continued to work on, for instance, one of my specialties as a graduate student was Paleocene, Eocene mammal evolution. would I be talking to you about that now?
Maybe, if it's interesting.
Maybe, if it was interesting.
If I found you somehow.
But less likely.
Right, less likely.
Although from seeing your skeletons and whatnot in skulls, I might be.
You might be.
Yeah.
Now, when you were doing that and you were talking to that guy, one of the things that he was saying in this dismissive way is, where is the evidence of this culture? Well, now we have Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is the evidence.
Because that was an American Association for Advancement of Science debate on the Sphinx, which turned out, I thought I was going in for a real debate. I thought it was going to be a great debate. We were really going to discuss the evidence back and forth. I brought all my data, the seismic data, which is very, very important, which we haven't even touched on yet. Other types of data we haven't touched on, because I want to make the point it's much more than a little bit of weathering on the Sphinx. And I've heard so many critics, even to my face, they say, well, you don't redate civilization based on a weathering profile. No, I've got lots more than weathering profile. The weathering profile and erosion is the easiest thing to explain, and yes, it's what I saw initially in that first 30 to 120 seconds, because that's before I brought in equipment and worked with Tom DeBecke to do seismic work, to do other types of more detailed analysis. I would not be talking to you today if it was just an erosional profile. I for my own self, I wouldn't put enough stock in that. Yeah, but when it ties in with everything else, we have a cogent picture. But getting back to someone being dismissive like that, that was 1992. Göbekli Tepe had technically been discovered back in the 1960s, but they misdated it completely. They thought it was maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years old, Byzantine or Roman, Greco-Roman period, not end of the last ice age, not 12,000 years old.
And how did they make the distinction that it was 12,000 years old? Is based on the soil samples?
That was Klaus Schmidt. Klaus Schmidt went back to it in about 1994-95, so a couple of years after that dismissive comment from the Egyptologist, Mark Lehner, who I think is the specific person you're referring to, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science debate, which I just wanted to make the comment. I went into that thinking that was going to be a debate. I came out of it realizing that they were just trying to set me up to put me down and shut me up forever, which they were not successful in doing.
Why do you think that they're so reluctant to just listen to the evidence and look at the information and consider the possibility that maybe there had been an ancient civilization?
Because it upsets the standard timeline, the standard story, and it also upsets a lot of people's concept of progression. And this is something John Anthony West liked to talk about. He called it the Church of Progress, that we've gotten better and better and better. And I talk to so many people that think that we are the end-all and be-all, we're the best that there ever has been. Well, maybe we are in terms of certain types of technology. And I'm not making any claim that people in the past could ever do what we're doing now, doing a podcast with all the electronics. But as I point out, that also makes us really vulnerable to things. But I would argue that there is a not so remote possibility that they knew things that we don't know, that they may have understood things that we don't understand. They may have had a worldview that would benefit us to at least have a feel for it. I mean, I don't want to go off on spiritual tangents. I could if I wanted to, or philosophical tangents. But I also have a training as an anthropologist. I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology on top of everything else. And I'm fascinated by human approaches to life and the environment and their situation. And I'm convinced that we do have things to learn from the ancients, whether it's the really remote ancients or the more recent ancients from only 5,000 years ago, even dynastic Egypt, and that it's not all simply a one-way progress, that there are fits and starts, that there have been high points and low points and high points again. And I'm not frankly convinced that we're at the highest point when it comes to certain aspects. We might be at a high point with certain types of technology, but I'm not convinced that we're at a high point when it comes to no.
Stone construction.
Oh, certainly not with stone construction. So there are types of technology we are not at a high point with, much less getting into this philosophical or spiritual or whatever you want to call it.
And we don't think of it as technology because we think of technology as being something that's electronic.
That's right. That's right.
Today.
And there are other technologies. Yes. And if you ask me how did they build the pyramids, I will tell you I don't know. If you ask me how they constructed the Sphinx Temple, they carved out those huge blocks of stone that can weigh 50 or more tons and move them in such tight spaces with such tight tolerances, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to...
No one really knows.
No one really knows. And sometimes people say, you bring in thousands of slaves or whatnot. Well, there's no evidence for that. And where would you have them stand when you're building the Sphinx Temple?
Right.
There's not enough room to
and there's
get around.
Stones are so big, even thousands of slaves struggle to move them. It's not like just
and
get a couple buddies, we're going to move this couch. No, we're not talking about that.
No. And you can try to hypothesize levers and that type of thing, but this has been said before, and I've seen, I wasn't there in person, but I've seen off-the-record footage of it when they've tried to just construct a little pyramid with very small blocks, and then they end up using modern machines, and they still aren't very successful. I mean,
so they knew a lot.
Yeah, they knew a lot. So there's a real resistance, I find, among a lot of my academic colleagues to want to even suggest that people could have known things in the past that we don't know now, or if they knew something in the past that we don't know now, it was so trivial that it was worth forgetting, worth not worrying about. So there's that concept. I find it amazing, and I hate to be stereotypic, some broad brushing, but many Egyptologists, when I read their works or I listen to them at conferences, etc., and I get the impression that they might love Egyptology and studying the ancient Egyptians, but they also have this view that, these guys made wonderful temples and had some fantastic art, but really, they're sort of primitive and isn't that silly? And do you see what I mean?
Right.
It's like the very thing
the
very thing they study, they put down,
in
a sense, to build themselves up.
And to build up this idea of ultimate progress that we keep going in a linear fashion.
Exactly. Then you also have in Egyptology, and I want to give you another example of this, not just me bringing in scientific evidence and data and the Egyptologists rejecting it, but just recently, in the last couple of years, have you heard about the project on the Great Pyramid, the Big Void? They've been using muography, which is a highly sophisticated technique using muons that come from outer space or come from the atmosphere. They go through the pyramid. You can set up detectors long-term and pick these up. They're sort of like think of X-rays technology, but using muons, which are sort of exotic particle that most people are not aware of because they just pass right through us without interacting. But when you've got massive stone will block some of them, so you can pick up essentially an image over a long period of time. So this is really high-tech physics, very expensive. A consortium of physicists did work on the Great Pyramid. I think it's still ongoing, but they put up, tens of millions, if not more, worth of a sophisticated physics equipment, gathered all this data. I've seen the raw data. I have a degree in geophysics, geology and geophysics. I have some ability to evaluate this type of data, whereas I hate to say a lot of the Egyptologists don't. And I found that with my own data when I shared my own data that, not to be nasty, but they didn't know what they were looking at, which is somewhat understandable since it's not their training. So you have with the Great Pyramid, just recently in the last couple of years, published in Nature, a very prestigious journal, they found what they believe is evidence for a huge void above the Grand Gallery that has never been known before. There we have a picture of it. The Egyptologists have been so resistant to this, saying this is nonsense, there can't be, there can't be anything new that we don't know about, or if it is, it's just trivial, it's just some space between the rocks, it's nothing important. But what I wanted to say, which is really important, some Egyptologists actually called for the whole project to be closed down because they don't like the results. And they've called it, quote, propaganda.
Closed down, but you're
More or
dealing...
less close down the whole scientific project. They don't. Not only do they not want to look at the data, they don't want more data collected that might contradict their standard point of view.
That's fascinating that someone would actually call for that, because this isn't even their study of their field of study, right?
Yes,
so you're dealing with physical evidence
Yeah.
that they're saying is nonsense, but this is not something they study in the first
Correct.
place.
Right.
So this void that we're looking at here in these images,
Yeah.
can you explain to people that are just listening what we're seeing?
Oh, what you're seeing is what they call a hidden chamber there, but you can see how it's parallel to the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is this huge gallery that goes up to the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid.
And that's deep in the pyramid.
That's deep
and
in the pyramid.
Hidden chamber is above that.
It's above it, parallels it, is maybe close to the same size of it. It's hard to tell until it gets probed. You know, you'd have to drill into it and maybe put a camera in. But I've seen the raw data. My point is I've seen the raw data. I certainly think it's important. They're interpreting it correctly. Now, the proof will be in the pudding, as they say, if they ever enter it or at least put a probe into it. But my point right now is to just dismiss the data is nonsense. To call for the whole project to be shut down is nonsense.
Who is
in
calling
my
for the
opinion.
project to be shut down?
Some of the Egyptian Egyptologists close to the ministry. And my point is they've done the same thing to me. So, for instance, when we did seismic work and we found the chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, that's never been explored since, at least not to my knowledge. And they just dismiss it and say, we know there's nothing there. And that was despite the fact that we also found a chamber at the rump of the Sphinx, which I didn't know about at the time, but they already knew about. So it confirmed that our data was good because we were finding something they knew about. But when we find something they don't know about and they don't want to be there, they dismiss it and don't want to pursue it further.
They have explored one of those chambers, correct? Did they explore the one that's in the rump?
The one in the rump, yes. The one in the rump, but it turns out they already knew about it. It's probably not super significant. It probably is just maybe a Greco-Roman or late period, burial or some kind of excavation. The one I believe is important is under the left paw of the Sphinx, which I believe is an archive. Actually may go back to this very early period because we now have hieroglyphic evidence indicating that.
What is the evidence that indicates it's an archive?
Okay, so recently, and this gets back to the Sphinx.
Yes.
Okay, so we started this portion of the discussion with the Sphinx and my initial observations of the Sphinx. And one of my observations was that there's something going on with the weathering and erosion on the Sphinx. The second observation, this is within the first 2 minutes at most, was that the head is too small for the body. The head is not eroded the way the core body is. It's not eroded the way the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are. It's not the original head. I hate to say it this way, but I knew immediately that was not the original head, just from a geological point of view.
Right.
And I believe that's now since been fully confirmed that this is not the original head. It was a recarved head. So for a long time, the question has been, in my mind, and we talk about this even on Mystery of the Sphinx, what was the original head of the Sphinx? What was the Sphinx originally? We've speculated, and other people speculate it might have been a lion, for instance, Leo, because it faces on the equinox the constellation Leo in the sky. Not today, but 10,000 BC or so, more or less at the very end of the last ice age. Now, I've had a lot of colleagues of mine, academic colleagues, say that's nonsense, it doesn't mean anything because they weren't even recognizing the constellations back then. We now have plenty of evidence that at least some of the constellations that we recognize today, Leo I would put in that category, Taurus is in that category, Orion is in that category. Some of them we don't have evidence for, but the ones I just mentioned, the these are constellations that go back well into the end of the last ice age. We have documents of that. We have mammoth bones where you have Orion carved on it. We have Taurus shown in cave walls. We have Leo shown. So to me, it's fascinating that some of these constellations that we recognize today were recognized tens of thousands of years ago. So to me, it's not nonsense that they carved a structure 10,000 BC approximately that was facing its own image in the sky. So one suggestion was that maybe it's Leo. But recently, Manu Safezadeh, Dr. Manu Safezadeh, another colleague of mine, he recognized initially that there is a title, what's known as a dual title, in dynastic Egypt that goes back to the 4th dynasty and even back to the 1st dynasty with the earliest writing, and it, when properly translated, basically refers to the Sphinx as the guardian of an archive, and not the Sphinx as we think of it as a lion with a human head, but as a lioness. And there was a name for this lioness, Mehet. She was the goddess Mehet, who guarded an archive. And we wrote a paper on that. When I say we, Manu Safezadeh, myself, and Robert Bouval, who you may know of from Orion correlation, and some of his work ties in with this, the archaeoastronomy. But we've now found that there is this sign, which we named the JAW sign in honor of.
Oh, that's awesome.
In honor of John Anthony West. There it is. There's the JAW sign. And what you see here is a lioness Mehet, which was the Sphinx originally based on our reconstruction and interpretation. And I can't go into all the details now. You can actually, people can read the paper. If I could put a plug in, if people go to my website, www.robertschoch, and that's ROBERTSCHOCH. The main thing is my name's spelled SCHOCH. So www.robertschoch.com, they can go. I did a popular summary of the paper, and they can also go and download the original paper in the peer-reviewed journal Archaeological Discovery, where we argue that what we have here is the lioness Mehet. She has what looks like a bent rod coming out of her back when people look at the actual image, and then above it is axe.
That's an axe?
Yeah, it's a primitive axe. When I say primitive, even for the ancient Egyptians in dynastic Egypt, it would have been sort of a symbolic axe, if you would, which was a sign of someone who was in charge of things, an overseer, that type of thing. The bent rod, what is that? That's a primitive key. We would now call it a primitive key, but it represents a key. And so it's basically saying that this is the guardian of the archives of Mehet, the locked chamber or vault of Mehet. And we also have images. I see it up on the board now. If you look at, you've got the lioness with the key, and you also have a lioness, not in that image, but a different image that we had before. If you look at that, can you see how there's a lioness, sort of a diagrammatic shape over what looks like a facade? Okay, if you then go to the stela that sits between the paws of the Sphinx, you have the same image, much more artistically rendered, of the Sphinx sitting over a facade, over what looks like a building. It's not really a building. It's the archive underneath, I believe.
So you think there's something underneath there?
Oh, I know there's something underneath, because long ago, in the early 1990s, Thomas DeBecke and I, when we did seismic work around the Sphinx, we found the chamber under the paws of the Sphinx. And it's, I'm sure, an artificial chamber. It's very regular. And this, I believe, could well be, I'm hypothesizing, and in science, we make hypotheses that are testable. This is perfectly testable. All we have to do is enter that chamber, even if it's just to put a fiber optic down, and we can see, is it an artificial chamber that's an archive? Hopefully there's still things there, or maybe it was gutted and cleaned out at some point. But here we have the seismic work, one of the seismic maps, I'll call it, stratigraphic data. And what's labeled as anomaly A, under the left paw, that is the chamber we found under the left paw that the Egyptologists have wanted to deny ever since, and they don't want to explore it, and we haven't gotten permission
Why
to
don't they
explore
want
it
to explore?
yet.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I know, but this is
if there's physical evidence.
This is
right?
politics in Egypt.
God, it's so squirrely.
Yeah, yeah. So now, okay, this is 1991 or so, early 1990s. As of last year, 2017, we have textual evidence, ancient hieroglyphs talking about this chamber, talking about the Sphinx, talking about the Sphinx being a lioness guarding a chamber. And I want to point out that the earliest hieroglyphs that we have that refer to this are about 3,000, 3,100 BC, which is hundreds of years before the Egyptologists claimed the Sphinx was even thought about being carved.
Which is somewhere around 2,500 BC?
2,500 BC.
And
So
that coincides with the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza?
Okay, well, that's another question.
Oh, sorry.
We'll come back to
Okay,
that
okay.
because I don't buy the, it's more, can we come back to
Yes,
that?
yes,
Yeah,
please.
so the Egyptologists claimed that the Sphinx was first carved 2,500 BC.
Right.
Yet there's no mention of the carving of the Sphinx then. They cite the not the inventory stela, that's another stela. They cite the Tutmosis IV dream stela, which is 1,000+ years later, which had at one point a partial cartouche of Khafra, which has since flaked away. It was there reputedly in the 19th century. There were drawings of it, which we, to put in our plug-in, just if people are interested in getting more information, Robert Bivol and I wrote a book published last year, called Origins of the Sphinx, where we discuss a lot of this. But Mehit is a more recent discovery. So there was a partial cartouche of Khafra, which Egyptologists said, aha, this proves that Khafra carved the Sphinx, because the Sphinx sits due east of Khafra's pyramid. Khafra was the pharaoh in 2,500 BC, therefore the Sphinx must be 2,500 BC. I contend, and Robert Bivol and other people who are in our line of thinking contend, that this stela that's over 1,000 years later does not say that he carved the Sphinx, but that he restored the Sphinx. Just like Tutmosis IV, who was putting up the stela, was restoring the Sphinx. And when you look at the Sphinx, it has been restored numerous times, including blocks of limestone that were put onto it to restore some of the very ancient weathering that when I asked Zai Hawass, one of my biggest critics, how old those blocks are, he said they were 4th dynasty. Now, why would you restore it in the 4th dynasty when it had just been built? Literally a century or two ago. You don't need to restore a meter worth of weathering. His answer, and I'm not trying to make fun of him, is that it's rotten rock, that it wasn't very high quality rock. So somehow it just crumbled away, a meter or so
Well, I saw his
in a
debate
couple of
with
hundred years.
Graham Hancock.
Yeah, but that's another
ridiculous.
issue. I don't want to get into that
Okay.
because let me just say it this way. There was not just science going on there was politics going on.
Right.
So,
there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on.
Okay.
Exactly. I've seen it too, and I've known all these people for
It's very frustrating.
decades. Yeah. So I'm trying to keep just to the
I
science right
understand.
now.
Right.
But so he himself admits that some of these repairs go back well over 4,000 years, which makes no sense if
It's
it
only
was
4,500 years old.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And they've always contended there was no inscriptions or anything really referring to the Sphinx until New Kingdom times. We point out in Origins of the Sphinx